Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable. There are going to be court challenges to this stuff, and they're going to refine their approach, I think, further as they go. But the other thing, of course, that this initiative has going for it is that it freaks out all the right people. I mean, libs stay losing their mind over this for all kinds of, to me, really frivolous and unserious reasons. Oh, these are young people. These are kids that work in tech or something. And they've talked for a while as if Elon has been like appointed king of the American government. Like this is some sort of completely unimaginable power grab on the part of an unelected official. But to me, it just seems like he's being put in exactly the position that he's best served in. The other thing everybody keeps saying that I don't agree with is that at some point there's bound to be a terrible clash between Trump and Elon, because Trump is always kicking his allies to the curb and disagreeing with them, especially if they're big personalities. And I could well be wrong about this, but I've never felt like that was actually a likely thing. Trump himself has mellowed out a lot, and Elon has a kind of different and complementary style and angle to what he wants to do. Plus, he's the biggest MAGA fan in public life right now.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the Editors and Publishers podcast at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I am your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the American Mind and the Claremont Review books. I am joined by our normal, I was going to say skeleton crew, but we're robust and non-skeletal. Your normal threesome. Oh, that's even worse. Sorry.
Stacked and muscular crew.
You're not helping, Spencer.
Oh, no.
Associate editor of the Claremont Review books and NATO skeptic, plenipotentiary Spencer Clavin, as well as managing editor of the American Mind, Mike Sabo. That joke will land in a while.
Am I a NATO skeptic? I don't think I know enough. I don't know enough information to be a NATO skeptic. I plead the fifth.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Well, it's another week and another fun episode in the travails of a blitzkrieg Trump administration. Doge has been much in the news, as it has been really the entire time, but they have seemed to hit their stride. There was about a 30-minute impromptu press conference with Elon, his preschool-age son, X, and Donald Trump, with Stephen Miller sort of in the background a little bit, and White House Secretary Will Scharf, who's become somewhat famous now as the guy describing and handing all these awesome executive orders to Trump. Will's an acquaintance and a very smart lawyer, and he's doing great work. Nice job, Will. Anyway, Elon talked a little bit about what they had begun to discover in the Doge saga, and pretty slapdash and anecdotal, but I thought it was both hilarious and revealing. Elon and Trump both seem convinced they're going to find $1 trillion of waste and fraud. I may be a little skeptical on that number, but I would not be surprised at all to see them get halfway there, at least. Elon reported that weird things kept popping up when you just do an audit of Treasury checks. For one thing, there doesn't seem to be and I just defer to Elon and what the team has discovered on this. I don't mean to claim to be an expert about Treasury Department processes, but they cut checks, Elon says, without any real coding system for what each check is for. So there's a big database problem in just setting up an audit or even trying to audit the Treasury Department. They don't have comment sections for descriptions of what's being paid and why. That just sort of basic corporate management stuff that Elon thought he would find there, but hasn't. We're paying somebody on Social Security rolls who's 150 years old, which led Elon to say, so either he's the most famous, longest living person, perhaps in U.S. history or world history, or he's dead, which I think he's probably dead. So these are small things, but Trump's example was, and I'm sure Trump is collecting these like little gems to keep in his repertoire. But there was a 3-month contract with somebody that was paid for 20 years before it was apparently just discovered. But stuff like that, you take a nation with a GDP in the trillions and trillions and federal expenditures in the a couple $3 trillion range, depending on the year. And it's not surprising that you're going to find lots of waste and fraud. Elon also had this hilarious story that he said at a certain point we were told we could only buy out 10,000 federal employees. I think he said a week, maybe a week. And they said, well, why is that a limit? And then Elon goes to talk about, he didn't mention the name of it, but there's this huge underground climate controlled document storage facility called Iron Mountain, not only for the federal government, but for other Fortune 100 and 500 companies. And Elon said, because of the way the elevator works and the 1970s file processing system, really the limit you could do to process paperwork would be 10,000 employees a week. Was it a month? I think it was a week. Anyway, to which Elon responded, "This is insane," which we heartily agree with that judgment. One last thing about Iron Mountain. I guess years ago they tried to digitize it all and they gave up after spending $100 million on it because it was just going to be too hard. So they reverted to the processes that were started in the 1970s when they started that facility. So things like this are leaking out. I suspect despite the left's efforts to paint Doge as some sort of constitutional or unconstitutional monstrosity, that it will remain fairly popular with the public. So I suspect it will be pretty consequential. So I actually want to revise what I may have said a month ago or so, that I was suspicious that Doge was going to be as earth shattering as a lot of people thought. But I'm warming to the idea significantly. There's a big plan for a reorganization of the federal bureaucracy. I'll just end my opening rant and hand it over to the guys with a little bit of a description of how the modern bureaucracy thinks about itself. We saw this with the USAID stuff, and there's emerging this narrative from the left and from Democrats. You had a couple of clutches of Democrats trying to raise the alarm bell over this coup, sometimes described as a fascist coup, that is being affected by Doge. There's lamentations from all corners that we talked about this, I think, last week. That some young, what do young guys know about reorganizing the federal government? They're just going to cause all sorts of mayhem. They're not experts. It's going to be a terrible thing. But the left has come to regard, and this is a theme as old as this podcast, has come to regard the fourth branch government, that is the bureaucracy, as really its own check and balance, especially on the executive, although that depends on who's in power. But really as a sort of free floating, somehow representative of the public and the public interest, a disinterested civil servant serviceocracy. Is that no? No, that's not going to work. The bureaucracy.
Yeah.
As I've mentioned this book on governing like 3 podcasts in a row now, so I promise I will stop after this.
Oh no.
But yeah, because of process, because of expertise, because of disinterestedness, the bureaucracy sees itself as sacrosanct and holy and uninfluenceable and unmanipulable by the political branches. That is a new innovation of the last century. So the backlash against Doge, I think, is of a piece with how we've done government now for the better part of 100 years, but especially for 70 years. And so I would expect the hysterical tone of a lot of its critics to continue. But it gets to fundamental questions about, I think, Trump's plan to really upset and overturn a good portion of modern bureaucratic, liberal, progressive executive government. And we're here for it. We're in favor of it. It's long overdue. And so you may hear some weird things from very different quarters, but you have to remember at root, this is about whether a people can govern itself through its representatives, or whether modern government and modern times demand this clerisy of bureaucrats who can't have hands laid on them by mere elected officials.
I think it's Aquinas who says, "Beware the Homo unius libri, the man of one book." This is becoming the podcast of one book. We're just going to keep talking about ungoverning for weeks.
I
on
promise
end.
it's the last, but I'll bring it up.
I'm gonna. Okay, famous last words.
This is the last podcast. I may have a little more to say on it in a minute, but yeah.
Less perhaps consecutive podcasts. You do not, I wouldn't preclude you from mentioning it 5 years down the line. Anyway, I'm basically on board, Ryan, with everything you just said. Doge has exceeded my expectations too so far. It's still early days. And I would say that probably my expectations were a little more bullish, maybe, than yours, just because to me, this endeavor has two big, broad strokes things going for it. One is the intuitive principle, which is that it just sounds like something that seems worthwhile. I can't say how much they're going to cut. I don't know if it'll be the $1 trillion they say it's going to be or something less than that. Even half of that would be a major gift to the American people and much long overdue. But Musk, as I was saying, I think 2 episodes ago, this is the thing that Musk excels at. He comes into places where everybody's been doing something one way for a million years and nobody knows why, but everybody is agreed that you can't change it because that would mess things up and rock the boat. And he says, "No, that's ridiculous. That's stupid. Why are we doing it this way?" And he won't take any answer other than, "Well, now we fixed it." Now, there's going to be all sorts of obstacles to that. There already have been. I think there are probably some judicial questions that people who know more about this stuff than I do can address, like the question of impoundment, right? Once the executive has been instructed to spend a certain amount of money, there are only some reasons why he he and the administration can choose not to. So that's obviously going to make its way to the courts. There are going to be court challenges to this stuff, and they're going to refine their approach, I think, further as they go. But the other thing, of course, that this initiative has going for it is that it freaks out all the right people. I mean, libs stay losing their mind over this for all kinds of, to me, really frivolous and unserious reasons. Oh, these are young people. These are kids that work in tech or something. And they've talked for a while as if Elon has been like appointed king of the American government. Like this is some sort of completely unimaginable power grab on the part of an unelected official. But to me, it just seems like he's being put in exactly the position that he's best served in. The other thing everybody keeps saying that I don't agree with is that at some point there's bound to be a terrible clash between Trump and Elon because Trump is always kicking his allies to the curb and disagreeing with them, especially if they're big personalities. And I could well be wrong about this, but I've never felt like that was actually a likely thing. Trump himself has mellowed out a lot, and Elon has a kind of different and complementary style and angle to what he wants to do. Plus, he's the biggest MAGA fan in public life right now. I don't know. I feel pretty good about all of this. Our one of our sort of frequently cited anon accounts, whom we should really try to get on the show, Crémieux, has a little breakdown of the latest executive order about Doge and points out that the major thing that's going on right now is agencies are ordered to develop a comprehensive reorganization plan that identifies offices that can be purged because they lack statutory protections and offices to consolidate. So they're obviously kind of zeroing in on what they can and can't do. And along the way, surely there will be bumps. Maybe they won't do everything that they've said right now that they've set out to do. But the two things that I don't think are true that are currently the major kind of objections to this, one is you can't do there's no authority anywhere for Elon to do this, which I just think is wrong. And the other is that the things Elon wants to do are sort of logistically impossible. And there I actually do just think that's where you don't bet on Elon. Maybe don't like buy hook, line, and sinker his vision of humanity. Maybe don't trust him to like reconfigure your brain, whatever. But on this score, the score of things that people say can't be done for logistical reasons, that's Elon's superpower. I don't know. I think he's likely to do a pretty good job with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the Elon Trump relationship, I mean, this is very different than, say, Trump and Steve Bannon, both probably much more similar personalities. I mean, with Elon's doing very different things. He's skilled, I think, in very different areas. So until I see something different, I think this is going to work out. I mean, as long as Trump keeps seeing results from Elon, I think he's just going to have him on board. I mean, ultimately, that's what he wants. He wants to see actual results, not just rhetoric. So I think this is going to be successful and until something comes that we possibly couldn't foresee, changes that. But I don't see that at all right now. I mean, I think Elon just found, it was upwards of $800 million in the Department of Education to cut. So that's great. I mean, and that's just the very start of this. I think for the people who say, oh, where's his authority? I mean, that's really ironic for just the idea of the Constitution. They hold this kind of ever evolving living document. It's like, since when are they worried about authority, institutions, law, etc. anyway? So that's just not made in good faith. And neither is the argument too, and it's been around where, oh, well, we didn't vote for this. Well, wait a minute, like Trump and Elon, they had rallies together. He's was talking about this on the campaign trail, I think, for months. Well, yeah, of course we did. We voted
I'm
for
pretty
all
sure
of
we
this.
voted for like exactly this. Like,
Yeah,
I would guess that the average Trump voter, this is pretty much what they had in mind.
Right. Like, it's amazing that we voted for these things and they're actually being done and right away too. Like, that's actually the thing that's shocking. So, again, I got to hand it to Trump for that. I mean, and I've said this before. I mean, he's taking this. He understands DC. He understands the blob. He understands what it takes now, and he's taking this very seriously. And it's just gratifying to see. And just in terms of, I think even last week I mentioned kind of the linkage between Trump and Obama. And I think there's a lot there. But I think this week, even you look at really Trump and, Nixon's second term, or what it could have been. Nixon was really going to take on the administrative state through impoundment and a bunch of other means. And especially if you read, John Marini and Glenn Elmers and some other scholars, I mean, I think the deep state kind of rose up to try to get him before he could get them. This kind of really is what is in my mind is what Trump is trying to do. I mean, really reorganize in a profound way, really reverse a lot of the things that FDR did. It's a true organization. It's getting back to a unitary executive who actually has everybody under his control. He actually is in control of these people, in control of these agencies and departments. I mean, to actually have the executive actually be in control of his own departments and agencies, that just hasn't happened in a long time, whether through the Supreme Court or other means.
I'm glad you raised the we didn't vote for this idea, because that's the least serious objection of all. I think
Completely.
this kind of project among the people generally is huge. I think there are people who voted for Kamala that would be, if you asked them in a vacuum and they gave you their unbiased opinion about this project specifically, I think they'd be all on board. Everybody knows, including the left, that there's enormous bloat in this region. Now, the left has reasons for hating the idea of getting rid of the bloat, but people generally are totally disgusted when they hear that their tax dollars are being sent overseas to fund like non-binary cats for Ugandan orphans or whatever thing it is. And similarly, when they find out that there's an assistant undersecretary of popcorn at the meetings of the Department of Education, they're appalled, as rightly they should be. I think if you gave the people carte blanche, like if you just said to Americans generally, have at it, go ham, you can do whatever you want, I think they would go in there with a sledgehammer. You would have to be like pushing them back. So actually, the main thing here is making sure that public appetite for streamlining the government doesn't spill over the boundaries of the actual Constitution, not the imaginary living document, not the fake objections that get invented by bureaucrats, but like genuinely, what can you do and what can't you do given the rules? There has been, like, once again, JD Vance says something completely normal and reasonable, and libs lose their mind. There has been a big furor over the idea that somehow this is going to generate a constitutional crisis, because there are court battles coming up. There are definitely dust-ups in the future. I suspect the administration sort of wants to adjudicate some of these things in court. And then Vance has tweeted recently, if a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the attorney general in how to use her discretion as prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. Now, he's saying something there which in principle is totally true, right? Like you're in a state of emergency and you have to like airdrop supplies to your troops, but a judge tells you you can't do it because it's like overtime hours for the pilot or something. Like you don't listen to that judge. There are definitely cases in which this is true. also, there are cases in which it would be a catastrophe for the executive not to listen to, say, a direct and unambiguous order from the Supreme Court. Like, and of course, everybody has interpreted this Vance tweet to mean we intend to run totally roughshod over the separation of powers. We have no regard whatsoever for the judiciary or any other branch of government. Like, but really serious people, grown-ups in the room, are just engaged in a classic American dispute over how can we execute this very serious mandate that involves pretty turbulent action to undo a bunch of bad policy. How can we do that clearly, cleanly, and efficiently without doing damage to our constitutional structure in the process? And frankly, like, that seems to be going pretty well in like real world land.
Yeah, the difficulty is, which I put kind of abstractly and too vaguely in my opening speech, is that constitutional structure of government means something very different to the left and the right these days. You know, their constitutional structure of government includes this 100 years of precedent about the bureaucracy and its insulation from political control, whereas ours is something more akin to the original vision of the federal government, which of course had plenty of administration. I mean, Hamilton talked about administration. You know, I think we brought it up last week. Any government badly administered can only be called a bad government. But the question is, what's the connection between the people's exercise of their vote, the candidates, especially presidential candidates, amassing of an electoral college coalition on a certain set of issues, as Trump did, including Elon alongside him for a lot of that case that he made to the people, and then what's their duty and power to execute. And the opening line of Article 2 of the Constitution is, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. As some of our colleagues over the years have put it, not some of the executive power, not part of it, not the executive power, but subject to civil service, intercession, or even judicial intercession, but the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. I think we're testing the viability of that doctrine in a government much transformed over the last century, and then especially since the 1960s. And included in that is Nixon. We've brought this up before. It's probably been 6 or 8 months or a year. But, the whole idea that DOJ was some floating independent law enforcement body that should be independent from the president in many cases, or if in most cases, and a watchdog over the executive branch. I mean, for subordinate officers and normal rule breaking and all the rest, sure. But if you look at the conduct of early American presidencies, it was quite clear that they thought that the president was the chief law enforcement officer in the country, and that the attorney general worked for the president. So it's been this weird distortion of our politics. It's how we talk about politics, especially in mainstream media, that embodies this distortion. And I think a return to it is a return to an older constitutional order that modern liberalism thought they'd left behind. And if we're sort of steel manning their argument as they understand it, they think it's essential to the decent functioning and the delivering of goods and services and the common good and the common welfare of America. So many of them are very sincere in their alarm about this return to the old ways. But a lot of us, don't think history moves in a straight line, right?
Yeah, their point of view is stupid. The progressive view is wrong on this subject. I mean, there is, I think, on the right, a degree of recklessness born of resentment from the abuses, the genuine abuses that have been perpetrated against conservatives with extreme prejudice, especially under the last administration, especially also during COVID and the wake of COVID and using COVID as a pretext. And so there's some people, I think, who say, look at what they did to us. Now we need to destroy them. That's not a good reason to disregard your enemies. But there is a good reason in this case, which is that they're just wrong. Like, it is possible, I feel like, to give too much charity and extend too much understanding to the opposing point of view here. It's such a complicated issue that you can get kind of bogged down in all the legal technicalities. But luckily, I'm an idiot and don't know anything about those legal technicalities. And even I can see that, plainly speaking, constitutional government is the Constitution. It's what's in the Constitution. Now, we've had obviously hundreds of years of debate about what that means, and that has produced certain decisions which are now precedent and therefore can't be just disregarded without getting overturned through the appropriate channels because it says so in the Constitution. But to overturn that precedent does not entail disregarding constitutional government. And that's, I think, ultimately the point of view you're describing, Ryan,
Yeah.
very aptly and charitably. That's what leads the left to say, like, oh, you've overturned Roe v. Wade, like our constitutional rights are going away. It's like, no, they're not. It's just a bad precedent that's been around for a while, which your theory of government taught you to regard as equally integral to our system of government alongside like the military and the executive branch. Like that was just a crap theory. And so unfortunately, now all of that is going to be dismantled and it's to the good. Like, I don't know. I feel I have very little time for the progressives on this.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of disingenuous argumentation going on out there from the left about how this is, you mentioned it, I think Spencer, or maybe Mike also. This is a return to somehow personal kingly rule, and of course, this is what Trump wants. And people fail to remember, or they don't know, or they're just willfully ignoring the literally century and a half, if not a little more, of a more sane division of labor between the three branches, and the fact that just because Trump wants to take an axe to this bureaucracy, it doesn't mean that all process is out the door. I mean, you have an executive administering the laws, doing audits of expenditures going out of the Treasury Department, getting rid of wasteful spending, canceling contracts that are I forget what the organization was, but I looked really quickly at the 800 million cut from education. And there was like one organization that received probably almost a third of that $800 million, Institute for the Research of, and then it's cut off because it's just in a giant spreadsheet. So I'm sure it's some giant contractor that trains educators or something, or does research for the Department of Education, whatever. This is not the end of the world, and it's certainly not the end of constitutionalism, but it's very difficult for people to think about it logically. And while we're on the topic of the problems with expertise, that is scare quotes expertise, we have this wonderful piece from Politico titled "Voters Were Right About the Economy. The Data Was Wrong." This is written by Eugene Ludwig, who's a former sort of government comptroller. So he's a man who knows about which he speaks. Let me just read a few paragraphs that are representative. Now, I should remind everyone that this is the same Politico that ran an article. Some wag on Twitter put them side by side. But before the election, Politico basically said, the problem with what you feel about the economy, voters, is you, not the economy, meaning you don't know what you're talking about. So we have this. Before the presidential election, many Democrats were puzzled by this. So he's alluding to this, by the seeming disconnect between economic reality as reflected in various government statistics and the public's perceptions of the economy on the ground. Many in Washington bristled at the public's failure to register how strong the economy really was. They charged that right-wing echo chambers were conning voters into believing entirely preposterous narratives about America's decline. What they rarely considered was whether something else might be responsible for the disconnect, whether, for instance, government statistics were fundamentally flawed. What if the numbers supporting the case for broad-based prosperity were themselves misrepresentations? What if, in fact, darker assessments of the economy were more authentically tethered to reality? Skip a few paragraphs. What we uncovered shocked us, meaning this former comptroller and people who looked at it. The bottom line is that for 20 years or more, including the months prior to the election, voter perception was more reflective of reality than the incumbent statistics. Our research revealed that the data collected by the various agencies is largely accurate. Moreover, the people staffing those agencies are talented and well-intentioned. So this is the normal sop to his friends who are in the bureaucracy, many of whom are well-intentioned. But the filters used to compute the headline statistics are flawed. As a result, they paint a much rosier picture of reality than bears out on the ground. Take as a particularly egregious example what is perhaps the most widely reported economic indicator, unemployment. And I would, just as an aside, this number, the unemployment number, and inflation and people's view of the economy are sort of all wrapped up into one, I would say. Known to experts as the U3, the number misleads in several ways. First, it counts as employed the millions of people who are unwillingly underemployed. That is, people who, for example, work only a few hours each week while searching for a full-time job. Second, it does not take into account many Americans who've been so discouraged that they are no longer trying to get a job. Finally, the prevailing statistic does not account for the meagerness of any individual's income. Thus, you could be homeless on the streets, making an intermittent income and functionally incapable of keeping your family fed, and the government would still count you as, quote, employed. I don't believe those who went into this past election taking pride in the unemployment numbers understood that the near record low unemployment figures, the figure was a mere 4.2% in November, counted homeless people doing occasional work as employed. But the implications are powerful. If you filter this is amazing. I mean, it's sort of, we'd assume this.
I cannot. It's just,
we'd,
and yet, right? You know it's bad, and then
this is. I mean, we assumed something like this was true, but here seems to be backed up by rough and real data. If you filter the statistic to include as unemployed people who can't find anything but part-time work, or who make a poverty wage, roughly $25,000 a year, the percentage of unemployed is actually 23.7%. In other words, nearly 1 of every 4 workers is functionally unemployed in America today. Hardly something to celebrate. Well, yeah, that is certainly true. So that was the reality on the ground that a lot of voters were seeing with their own eyes, despite what the lying statistics were telling them. It's a tale as old as modern government, but it's nice to have some validation from even Politico and an authority, a former comptroller of the U.S. Treasury. I think he was. So it's it's just the latest entry in like that conspiracy theory that the right wing was touting. Actually, that's true.
I don't think I have ever loved a topic that we have done on the history of this podcast more than I love this topic. I cannot believe this article exists. I couldn't have wished it into being if you had granted me 3 wishes. This is, if only somebody had been saying this, if only there were some way the Democrat politicians, before they walked into this totally unanticipated election loss, if only there were some way they could have known that they were being bullish about the economy for no reason, baselessly, based on nothing other than their own self imposed blindness. If only somebody had said that, oh, wait, Republicans writ large and people in general were saying that over and over again, except that they had created this fake data lens, this kind of blinders built out of numbers to keep them from seeing it. I mean, all of these statistics basically amount to, we created an official number that excluded everything that we don't like. So we were looking at employment, but we didn't count homeless people working part-time. Once you count everybody, right, Ryan, the big one is fully almost a quarter of the workforce is actually unemployed. But everything gets worse when you take in the actual data, like the actual realities on the ground. Wages get worse, inflation gets way, way worse. I mean, the inflation numbers that they were relying on basically take into account everything except the stuff that people on the lower half of the income spectrum tend to buy, like, oh, I don't know, food, gas, So
Food and fuel
all of this,
and housing.
yeah, right. Like, just the essentials. Everything is cheap except for like protein, except for something that you need to survive. Eh, There's so much in here. And the cherry on top is that it's being published now like some great revelation because it comes from a moderately friendly source, somebody with background kind of within the machine. I couldn't love it more. I want to slather this article all over my body. I want to inject it into my veins. It of course confirms everything that we've been saying about the fakeness of statistics, like not the fakeness of numbers necessarily. It is contrary to popular belief and despite what our political system might lead you to think, it is actually possible still to count things. Like, you can put objects in front of you and number them. It's one of the humankind's great innovations. It's part of the image of God in us. Like, we have the capacity to count things. We also have the capacity to lie and lie and lie. And of course, our worst lies, as is well known, are statistics. And this is just a great example of like something comes with a number attached to it, any number at all, especially if that number has traveled through a hyper circuitous route, black box route of like different calculations that somebody with a funny hat on tells you is right. Like, this is the clerisy. They will just tell you, what you see is wrong, and actually you have to believe in the like 20 angels that dance on the head of a pin and produce good unemployment numbers. I find it incredibly shocking that this is something that needs to be published in Politico, but in fact, like the degree of self-deception is such that somebody actually had to write this article. I just love it.
And it's really telling too, because I mean, an article like this, say if Kamala somehow pulled it out, absolutely would never have been published. It's almost kind of a sop saying, yeah, you kind of do see reality, but in 6 months to a year, you're not even going to remember this article. It'll go down the memory hole. We'll be on to the next thing. Trump's a fascist dictator for whatever. So like they have these nuggets every once in a while. The left is very good at this, at like kind of making you believe, oh, they actually maybe do care about truth in some way, shape, or form. Let's maybe give them something. And then there's just going to be a whole avalanche of just preposterous propaganda. After that, the Politico is going to run, of course, subsidized by DC, by the way.
If, God forbid, the Democrats win the next election, we'll be on the breadlines reading about how employment has never been better.
Right. Absolutely. You're going to forget about, this article, like CPI, driven prices up by 4.1% in 2023 alone, but the true cost of living as measured by our research rose more than twice as much, a full 9.4%. Like, of course, I knew it. My wife and I were actually just looking through our grocery bills, and it's insane just how much they've gone up just even in the past 2 years. Obviously, with two little ones, formula is insanely expensive, but still, like, we saw this. This is really obvious. This one, since 2013, Americans with bachelor's degrees or more in the aggregate have seen their material well-being improve. By the Fed's estimate, an additional tenth of adults have risen to comfort. Great. Those without high school degrees, by contrast, have seen no real improvement since 2013. And that's certainly what I see on the ground, but there's just this massive cognitive dissonance between, this kind of just fake reality, this like West Wingization that the left has just kind of created, this just alternate thing. Fortunately, nature, there's a pitchfork that comes, and now we're being, kind of prodded into, they are at least, into trying to see, reality. But it's just amazing what, this is why Americans voted for Trump, at least partly. They saw what was going on with their paychecks, with the cost of living. Home prices have absolutely exploded. So this is one of the many reasons why you get Trump. You deny, what's actually going on in front of your eyes, and this is what happens. That doesn't mean the left is never going to win again. They certainly are. But this just shows just the absurd nature of what they think reality is.
Yeah, this type of article too usually serves one of two purposes: either for the left to take a victory lap after a nefarious plot was well executed. So Molly Ball's piece in Time after the 2020 election saying, well, of course there was a cabal between NGOs, lawyers, and political operatives and comms people to prevent Trump from winning by hook or crook. Yeah, she didn't quite say that, but it was like all over between the lines. Or to
the grand American tradition of cabals, the beloved American cabal.
So to take a victory lap, or to absolve them from responsibility and complicity in deception. So a few examples: the pieces after COVID saying, can't we all just admit mistakes were made, and really we shouldn't have any
amnesty,
no recriminations, please. And what was the other one? The other absolution one was, was this one? Well, come on. Look, statistics are hard. They're a little misleading. Bureaucrats are basically good, but it turns out that things were really pretty bad. And no malicious actors were involved in portraying this as in order to advance their political interests. But we can now admit that this was actually the case. And then the other, I just wanted to mention in the Doge context, I saw this recent reporting on that Elon Trump thing at the White House yesterday. It was like, Musk and the president assert that government is and the bureaucracy is rife with corruption and waste without any evidence, without any evidence. Never mind, they gave a bunch of anecdotal evidence at that press conference, but it all fits together, right? The experts' data and their judgment is sacrosanct, and without any citation to official government or academic studies, you're making up fake news. And then they reserve the right to alter history after the fact in order to make themselves look better.
Yeah, can I just add one analog, I think, in the cultural sphere, Ryan, is the pieces that are now appearing in the New York Times to the effect that we've all always agreed that, of course, there's a little bit something a little bit absurd about wokeness, right? I mean, we all know that making plays about disabled black trans drug dealers, that's sort of passe. And no acknowledgement that this is something the Times was championing. The art section of the Times until about 5 minutes ago was wall to wall profit, like plastered at Soviet levels of just party line conviction that what we absolutely must now have is the Ugandan trans opera. Like, this is the brave new artistic venture that tells us everything we need to know about the human condition. And all of a sudden, as it starts to become clear that the money's going to dry up for this stuff and audiences are not going to sit through it, even in Marvel movies, suddenly you get these reviews like of engaging, a witty, piquant new play that pokes holes in some of the excesses of woke culture. Oh, it's American fiction about how black people actually might feel somewhat trivialized, perhaps, and tokenized by this idea that black authors are important just because they're black. Isn't it hilarious? And aren't we so clever for figuring this out? With no acknowledgement that, of course, conservatives have been sort of saying this for generations. So anyway, yeah, this is totally a thing that they're always pretend that they thought of this, I guess, and now we'll get the economic version of it for as long as expedient.
And look at the Times too. I mean, the genesis of wokeness. I mean, you have the 1619 Project. You've got columnist Charles Blow, who actually I think I think he's gone now. I think he wrote his last column, so he's gone. But I mean, yeah, it's absurd. It's like you want us to forget that you're the people who boosted all of this. Columns, Nicole Hannah-Jones. I mean, come on. I mean, they're the people who boosted, obviously her career in the stratosphere. So don't give us that stuff. We remember.
I guess you could say he blowed that pop stand. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should note, I think many of our listeners maybe took note of this, though, that Ibram X. Kendi is now out at Boston University, having squandered 40, $60 million. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was 20, but it was a lot of money. His center is defunct, and he's now retreated to Howard University, a historically black university. The Times, for a while, treated him like royalty, and as if he could utter no wrong. So it's just, yeah, the whole place is rife with it. I would just want to flag for people further reading over at tomklingenstein.com, our chairman, who has his own publication, our friend Glenn Elmers, with a piece called Setting Fire to the Deep State. And Glenn reviews the book I shall not mention again, but it's really a longer essay on how we got to hear about how lazy academics have gotten in defending the administrative state. The book is, I mean, I've discovered this too in reading it, is surprisingly thin. And actually, Glenn points out, which I had noticed, but I hadn't really put it all together, the surprising amount of citations they have to obscure left-wing centers, NGOs, and publications, from Vox to Southern Poverty Law Center to the ACLU's publication. So there's this whole ecosystem that's now quite mature, which spans the university and the federal government. And it's this iron triangle of bureaucrats, academics, and disproportionate membership of one party, the Democratic Party, although some Republicans are plenty guilty over recent decades, in creating this whole self-referential and self-citing apparatus to justify this way of doing modern government, which we should note stands at an all-time low in public confidence. That is the federal establishment. I mean, 15% or 13%, while at the same time having a record number of people fearing the federal government. This is the atmosphere into which Trump rode down the escalator. And in many ways, I think we've said this before, and certainly others have commented, actually, it was kind of a blessing to lose the 2020 election for Trump, because now he's got a new team, some of the old team that was loyal, and a lot of new members in the team, either newly converted or now entering government, who want to enact his agenda. He's got more people rowing in the same direction. He's got a country that seems much more amenable to the broad strokes of his agenda. His public approval so far is at 53% last I checked. So it's sort of a whole new golden era or golden age for government reform. And, I think our role at Claremont is to remind people of the long intellectual and scholarly backbone to this critique of the modern way of doing government, even while much more practical men new to politics like Elon are in there with a bunch of whiz kids just looking at the books and saying, what the hell is this thing? We got to do something about this.
Can someone explain to me how, in this environment, it is still possible to disbelieve in God? Given everything you just said, Ryan, which is so abundantly true and so obviously impossible to have been engineered. Like nobody on the right wanted for Trump to get kicked out of office. Nobody wanted him to lose the election, but he did, and he left, and he came back so perfectly positioned after 4 years for his opponents to basically, 4 years of rope for his opponents to hang themselves with. Meanwhile, the actual hand of the literal Holy Spirit reaches down and swivels his head by one of those acute angles you had to find the value of in trigonometry class, such that he survived. I mean, to me, the biggest question is like, are there any actual atheists remaining out there, especially on the right? And if so, what's your excuse?
No, and actually, that's a great point. I was just reading Larry Sanger. So I think he's one of the co-founders of Wikipedia, and he wrote a very, very long article, but very good, about how he turned from atheism to Christianity. And he noted just all these instances of things that just somehow just randomly come together. It's like you can't explain it. And then he looked at, too, just like the new atheists of his age, just like the mediocrity of their works, Richard Dawkins, Dennett, etc. And it's a great read.
Yeah, that's a really remarkable little addition to a larger, I think, trend, which is the sort of intellectual revival, prominent, not necessarily politically partisan, but very respected intellectual figures converting to Christianity. Matthew Crawford, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Sanger is another one, kind of addition to that. I was actually just in DC with Ross Douthat, Claremont Institute fellowship alumnus, I believe. Is he a
Publius
Publius
alum? Yeah.
fellow? Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And he's got this book that came out on Tuesday called "Believe: Why Everyone Should Believe in God, or Why Everybody Should Be Religious," I think is the subtitle, which is really good. First of all, by the way, even if you already believe, it's very worth reading because Ross is just a very eloquent and kind of lucid writer, makes a really good case. But also, it's interesting that this is a book not just saying it's possible to believe in God, or we can still believe in God despite kind of some of the objections that have been raised, despite the cultural climate, despite the general kind of intellectual atmosphere, but rather, as you say, Mike, like that whole thing, that whole fad has really played itself out. And at this point, actually, it's kind of remarkable how weak and exhausted materialism is. I was saying at that event that when I wrote my book, which is about kind of the larger history of materialism and how it rose to dominate the mind of the West, when I started writing it, I would have called it something like, what is materialism and why is it wrong? By the time it came out, I realized this is actually like what was materialism and why was it wrong? Like in some ways, this book and a couple others that came out around the same time feel like putting a pin in a movement that is really past. That's just kind of an interesting thing that's going on along with the whole Trump stuff.
Yeah. Ross was a 2002 Publius Fellow. And one of his fellow fellows was Stephen Menashe, who's now a Second Circuit Court of Appeals judge based out of New York and worked for the first Trump administration. So it's always fun to go back and look at the alumni and see where they went. Yeah, I didn't think we'd take a turn to the inevitable conclusion that God exists from our discussion of bureaucracy, but there we are.
Sorry, yeah. I rested the steering wheel away.
Somebody has to run something.
I'm not
meditate.
I'm not disputing any of your assertions, Spencer, so don't take it that way, of course. We did want to take a little bit of time to answer some mail. Just one piece, really. I will note, just for the record, that there's sort of an few weeks old letter we got challenging a bit our discussion of the unmanliness of whining about the current state of the economy. I just want to flag that and recognize that we got that email. I'm sorry we didn't get to it. It's now a bit of a stale topic. We'll see if we can work it in. But it was a good critique of our general approach to it. And I think the Politico article about the state of the economy would have lent our critiquer a little more ammunition. That is to say, look, at a certain point, given the statistics you cited, Mike, especially about young folks without college degrees, to merely talk about whining about it as unmanly is probably not quite fair. So, point taken. Okay, so here's a question from Samantha out in the Mountain West. I've just completed my freshman year as a city council member. I'll leave it a little vague so people don't try to burn down our house, although our listenership won't attack her. It's been a whirlwind. As the issues that our community faces, the ideas and concepts I've been introduced to by the American mind and other local officials' opinions all simmer in my head, I find myself a little stuck. I ran my campaign on a community first ideal. What I thought this to mean was simple: involved residents make their wishes about city issues known to their elected officials, and we work to honor them in the most tax efficient, law abiding, reasonable way possible. Of course, we have to take care that no civil liberties are violated or property rights, but in a big picture way, we should be acting to pursue the stated goals of residents. I thought that this is what the job of a city council member should be. Other council members have expressed that actually the role of a representative is to make decisions that are in the best interest of the community, regardless of whether it is what they want or not. And I suppose I kind of understand that. In our specific town, land use is a huge issue. Residents constantly express their displeasure with large apartment complexes and hundreds of acres of new single-family homes. Then we have city staff and other experts saying that if we don't build, grow, expand, it will be detrimental to our community. I don't mean to ask about this specific example. I'm more curious about what you think is the best way to approach local issues like this. Is there a framework to balance both the will of the represented and what might be best long term? Any resources you could recommend about city government or local governments would also be appreciated. Well, this is an age old question of politics, right? And a question about representation. Publius in the Federalist Papers talked about the balance that had to be struck between the immediate interests of local constituencies, and it's in mostly in Federalist 10, and the argument about the virtues of an extended republic or extending the sphere of republicanism, to balance those local concerns, which can be kind of factional at times and a bit overly local, and pitting debtors against creditors and all that sort of stuff, but while also pursuing the larger goal, Publius hopes more often than not, of the, and this is a direct quote, the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. This is a tension always in representative government. And I think you just have to strike a balance between what you think is popular but unwise policy and how you combat that. And then maybe some lesser known, maybe a little unpopular, especially in the short term, but ultimately much better for the community policy going forward. Ultimately, I guess the best you can do is exercise your judgment. You have to take into consideration the concerns of your constituents and help them when it's possible and when it's legal and sound. Ultimately, you have to throw yourself back on their mercies if you have to make some more controversial decisions. I would say that there is a lot in this. Some experts, always be wary of experts, and city staff as well. I mean, the city managers perform a very useful function, but they're organized educational institutions, that is, of city management, are fundamentally progressive, have always been, or at least have been for 50 or 60 years. So I would say to take those recommendations always with grains of salt. And there's especially all sorts of politics and demographic factionalism in this build, grow, expand mindset, because it quickly gets to the questions of the suburbs versus the denser city, and that often boils down to questions or clashes of interests between the urban poor or the semi-urban poor or the semi-suburban poor, who disproportionately tend to be non-white minorities of some various flavor. So it's all wrapped up in our current identity politics factionalism as well. As for resources, actually, let me put the call out to any of our regular listeners. And I have one in particular who I'm going to ask, one of our former fellows, who may have some more specific resources about city and local government for you. So I'm flagging this. We'll talk a little bit about it next week. But a broad, good book to start with is this classic from the 90s by Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Now, its judgments might be slightly off subject for a local city council in the Mountain West, given different densities and all that. But it is the classic urbanist work. And Jane Jacobs was sort of a layperson who came to this not from an academic perspective, but from an on the ground gimlet eye about what made cities great. And so I think she would offer some very good general principles and some wonderful insights into how to think about this issue. And then you can apply those to your particular circumstances, given what you're observing on your city council.
Yeah, that all seems very wise. I don't have too much granular advice to add. I guess my only further comment is, forgive me if I'm misreading the details of the email or if I'm off base here, but it seems to me like one thing you're reckoning with is just the nature of representation, which is somewhat different than we've been kind of led to instinctively feel. I think we imagine that elected officials are kind of appointed or hired by the people to then just do everything that the people in aggregate want. That's roughly true, but actually what they've done is they've put you in charge, because these many of these decisions are not the sort that can be made via a sort of Rousseauian general will. They involve more individual judgment. You personally, as one human, need to make these decisions. And sometimes they're going to be unpopular, and sometimes they aren't, for reasons that will be apparent to you, but not necessarily to your constituents. They aren't going to be what the majority of your constituents would vote for if assembled kind of en masse. And that is what they appointed you to do. Like, your job as a representative is to be one person rather than a giant sum total aggregate blob of multiple people, because we don't believe in plebiscites really in this country. Like, we actually believe that the people delegate their authority in part to you, not exclusively to you, but insofar as they've given you any authority, they've given it to you, and they're not using you as a sort of avatar or projection of themselves. They are actually telling you, go forth and make wise, prudent judgments on our behalf, which is a slightly different job than to just become like a funnel or a mouthpiece for what everybody happens to want. So, and some, I guess I'm just trying to alleviate a little bit of like emotional stress.
And I would just add, just to know, the traditions and history and just local things just about the people of your town. Like Tocqueville talked about, Americans kind of have a tendency to go to general principles. I would say this is a place, to know the general things, certainly, but then you can't universalize the whole thing. Then you have to really get down to specifics and really use your judgment. And I would say just talk to other people in city councils around the town that you're in. I'm sure you're not the only one that is dealing with this right now. This is a problem that, even in southwestern Ohio, where I'm at in Cincinnati, there are definitely towns around here that have had to deal with the same thing. So, talk to people who have been on city council for a long time, who have some judgment, some wisdom that you're looking for, and that may help too.
Yeah, and we should say, don't be allergic to the occasional exercise of power politics, even at the city council level,
Mm-hmm.
because you need allies in politics and you need to do well by your constituents. But it will be the case that you will run into certain factions and interests that will have your back in the future and are doing good work themselves. Don't just back merely corrupt folks. But so just take some care to take care of your friends and occasionally throw some wrenches in the wheels of your enemies. And I mean that in a sort of best civic minded sense. I should hope that no one, even at your local city council level, is truly your enemy. They're your fellow citizen, but don't be allergic to occasionally taking care of that older way of doing politics, which Republicans used to be comfortable with, and that Now, you may have to go back well into the 19th century. Patronage politics is effective and useful often. And as long as it's not corrupt, you shouldn't sniff at it. I will just point everyone to, if you want some like deep dive on this, go read, who's the great contemporary scholar of Lincoln, Spencer? The guy has these 2 huge volumes. I'll look it up. Anyway,
Burlingame, Michael Burlingame.
Michael Burlingame. Yeah, thank you, Mike. I knew Sabo or Spencer would have it. Burlingame wrote this huge, exhaustive 2-volume work on Lincoln, and I think the first volume of it had a lot on his years in Congress, which was not that many years, but it showed that even the great emancipator, the great Lincoln, who we read the second inaugural and the Gettysburg Address, when he was in Congress, man, he took care of his people. He log rolled like the best of them. He knew how to exercise power in a legislature. So don't be allergic to that sort of occasional grubby bits of local politics. Well, on that high note, or realpolitik note, or just prudential note, I think we'll have to end for today. We've gone a little bit over an hour. So we didn't get to Pete Hegseth and the reorientation of our defense policy in Ukraine, but maybe we'll talk about it next week. I want to thank everyone once again for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more about our work, go to claremont.org. If you want to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate. We're finishing up in the coming week or two the latest issue of the Claremont Review books, so keep an eye out for that at ClaremontReviewBooks.com in the coming weeks. Go to AmericanMind.org, and if you want to look at all sorts of great, exhaustive database reporting on the way that the left is funded and our reports on higher education and wokeness and all of goings on in DC, go to dc.claremont.org. And I should finally say, I think I've neglected it for a couple weeks, but we want to thank Stephen Limbaugh for our intro music, still just about a month old. And thank you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.